You need to have flags or circuit breakers, if you want to call them that. Like there needs to be a behavioral circuit breaker. And for him, what it was if you're having fun in the midst of a conversation or in the midst of a debate, you probably need to step away.
Welcome to 20-Minute Leaders. Just sit back, relax, and learn from the leaders of today. It's a journey. Each one is different, unique, inspiring. Let's get started. This episode is powered by J Ventures, a community-driven VC fund in Silicon Valley, in partnership with Leumi Tech, sponsored by Hippo Insurance, Upwest Labs, Turing, Hillel at Stanford, Leap, and in media partnership with CTech. This episode is going to be all about the psychology of leadership. I welcome Christopher Coultas with me, Vice President of Product Innovation and a Senior Leadership Consultant at Leadership Worth Following LLC. He personifies the scientist-practitioner model in the fast-growing field of industrial organizational psychology. He has coached hundreds of leaders and dozens of teams on how to leverage enhanced self-awareness for optimal leadership impact. His book with Leadership Worth Following, Driven Not Drained, Discover Your Path to Career Happiness, Effectiveness, and Influence, is a candid, engaging, and comprehensive look at both the science and practical application behind human behavior. Chris Coultas, welcome to 20-Minute Leaders. Thank you so much for joining me. Are you in Texas right now?
I am, yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm in the DFW area.
Amazing. Thank you for joining me. I love that I get to talk to people all over the US and all over the world. And this episode, like I mentioned right before we started, is special to me because if, most episodes I get to dive into a very specific niche and domain and problem, now I get to talk a little bit more broadly also about something that I'm experiencing myself and a lot of my friends are as well. I'm watching friends and, in my university, this idea of driven and drained. And this idea of motivation and purpose and the tech ecosystem today. And I'm really excited to talk to you now with a PhD from the University of Central Florida in industrial and organizational psychology. But Chris, before we even get into all that, I really want to know what brought you to be so curious about the psychology of organizations and leaders?
Well, I've always been curious just about kind of why people do what they do. And I got into psychology because of that just generally. And I think most people get into psychology thinking they'll end up being a counselor or therapist or something like that. As I explored that, so I kind of started pursuing that and realized that was not going to be a good fit for me, just kind of from a personality standpoint. I don't think I would be able to kind of turn it off. And so that would have led me to burnout. So I pivoted because I wanted to help organizations be more effective. I mean, work is a huge part of our lives. And so, if I can play my small part in making work life better, and honestly, at some point, I'd love to do this kind of stuff with nonprofits and help nonprofits be more effective. Just kind of doing my small part to make the world a better place by helping leaders and organizations be better.
So my issue with this conversation of draining and motivation is that a lot of times people look at young entrepreneurs that are working so hard and what they keep turning us off and they say, stop, don't do so much, take a break. And it's very contradicting to what we feel. And so it doesn't really help. And so I'm curious to hear now from more of a scientific and research perspective, what is this, what's happening in 2021 and what have you been observing, especially in this idea of driven and drained?
Yeah, so I mean, 2020 was crazy, and 2021 is different but similar in a lot of ways, right? We're still kind of transitioning out of that, hopefully. But I think that as you think about entrepreneurs and you think about the passion that draws you into being an entrepreneur, of course that's going to lead you into working a ton, and in outside looking in, it makes a lot of sense that people are going to tell entrepreneurs to kind of slow down, maybe not work so hard. And I think that there's some wisdom in that. But I think where I would qualify that advice or that statement is not to say work less, but work more intentionally. And really, that's what a lot of my work is about, is giving people the self-awareness to realize, because it's so easy when you get sucked into something that you're passionate about, to kind of fall into tunnel vision of our own traps that our own personality can draw us into. And the beauty of self-awareness and intentionality is, you can still do everything that you're passionate about. You can still do what you love, but taking the time to step away, zoom out for a minute, and realize, if I keep doing it like this, then I can get myself into some big trouble. So I mean, I'm happy to share thoughts or share kind of anecdotes on that, but I'll pause there just for your reactions on that.
No. Please, I'm excited to hear them. Yes.
Oh yeah. So like an example of that, then I was working with a younger leader who first time kind of building his team, managing people, and so one of his kind of MO, what made him successful, was he was just super willing to be super helpful. And he enjoyed it. He enjoyed being kind of like the thought leader, enjoyed being the person that, you could go to and be helpful. But what he found was that over time, people were coming to him with less and less relevant things, things that were outside of his wheelhouse, but he couldn't stop himself from saying yes. And he had this kind of compulsion to be helpful. He felt like it was wrong to say no. And so he was pursuing this kind of style of, I want to be helpful. And it ended up being really problematic because he spread himself so thin. He was kind of going off vector in terms of his career path. And so that's maybe not a super entrepreneurial example, but it isn't it, like, it kind of gives you a hint of, if you're not doing something, if you're doing things thoughtlessly, if you're pursuing your career thoughtlessly, then you're apt to get sucked into some of the unhelpful aspects of whatever your personality might be.
Right. And so, you take a person like this, and I think it's, you can just extrapolate on that example to a bunch of other behaviors that people may have. And so, what do you do then? What are some things that a person in that situation could do because, once you get into a spiral and once you get into a bad habit, whether it's working hard or some other, abuse of some other behavior, I definitely don't know how to deal with that.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. With this specific example, what I found that was super helpful with this guy was calibrating his expectations. And this is where like scientific assessments can be really helpful, but you don't necessarily have to go that far. But basically, in the assessment that our firm uses, the drive, he scored a 97th percentile on this driver called service. So he was driven to be helpful. Service was hugely important to him. And what I challenged him on was, you are the outlier. Your expectations, and you're holding yourself to an excessively high standard. You will still be a more helpful than most person, even if you challenge yourself to say no more. So that's kind of one technique. The other technique, and then I'll pause and hear your thoughts. But I was working with another guy who he loves to get into debates. He just loves to, once you get into it, and maybe you're like that, I don't know, but if it's a fun topic, you kind of go back and forth. For him, what feels like a fun conversation to the average Joe or Jane is probably like, wow, you're coming on way too strong, way too intense. And that's part of his personality. That's part of his motivators. And so what I challenged him on, and maybe this is something that you can kind of take away, is you need to have flags or circuit breakers, if you want to call them that. Like there needs to be a behavioral circuit breaker. And for him, what it was if you're having fun in the midst of a conversation or in the midst of a debate, you probably need to step away. Because if you're having fun, that means more statistically speaking, the other person probably isn't.
Wow. And so what you're actually, describing here, this idea of, the circuit breakers is sort of like these personalized flags that give you this alert that even though your mind is telling you one thing or your intuition is telling you one thing, you're basing off of, sort of science or statistics that it is actually something else. And you've identified these different circuit breakers that allow you to then just modify the environment around you. This ties back a lot for me to the research I got to do with Professor Dan Ariely on irrationality and why we do what we do when it comes to irrational thinking. And then his thesis, considering all the research he's done, really comes down to the point of we can't really control our own irrationality, but we can very much control our environment. And so if I know that I'm not going to be able to resist the chocolate cake, well, then I shouldn't bring a chocolate cake into the house in the first place, because I don't want to be put in that situation, right?
Exactly. Yeah, no, I think that's a great example.
Now, talk to me a little bit about, career happiness, sustained career happiness, because until now, we're talking about behaviors, we're talking about, things that may make us more or less happy in the day-to-day, maybe leading to burnout, which is obviously a big problem and can lead to other side effects. But when we're talking about sustainable career, and especially in the world of leadership, what is sort of the science or the interesting ideas that are being put forth in those domains?
Yeah, so I would say there's probably two or three things to touch on there. One is, it goes back to what we were just talking about. Actually, is that self-awareness, because I think what happens, especially early in careers, is happiness is really complex. In the assessment that I've kind of mentioned in our book, Driven Not Drained, we found that there are 28 things that motivate or drive behavior or drive happiness. And I mean, that's a lot of things to kind of balance at the same time, right? And when people talk about chasing your happiness or chasing your passion, that often leads to kind of like a tunnel vision or a very narrow or myopic way of pursuing your career. So I'm driven by creativity, and so let me go pursue a creative job. But I didn't take into consideration the fact that I'm drained by deliberation and bureaucracy and collaboration and those kinds of things. And so I end up taking a job that makes me happy in one area of who I am, but really just sucks the life out of me in another area.
Right. And so, especially for young, entrepreneurs, and today, decision making, especially in the tech ecosystem, becomes earlier and earlier. And oftentimes you're dealt with life decisions that previously people just didn't have the privilege to be able to handle. And so what are ways that we can be intentional and thoughtful as we go about making those decisions properly?
Yeah, so I think there's two things. One is actually developing the self-awareness beforehand, before you get into the situation. That way, you're able to be thoughtful and kind of make a decision that is aligned with who you are. But I think the other thing is really getting a sense of, or is designing or developing more realistic expectations. And that's a big thing that I see in early career professionals. Is early career professionals tend to have are really driven by purpose. They're really driven by this, like, I want to change the world. But paradoxically, they're also they often tend to be drained by some of the things that might actually help them change the world. And so you have this expectation that things are going to be amazing, but you overlook the fact that there's a lot of hard work and a lot of grind work and things like that. And so I would encourage early career professionals and entrepreneurs to kind of temper expectations going into any role.
So leadership worth following. What is that? What is, and I'm asking that also in the context of, what are ways for leaders in today's world to become better leaders? Aside from just, going through experiences and trying to, debrief and get it better by themselves, what is leadership worth following, and what is the greater trend that we have today in terms of helping leaders grow?
Yeah. So the idea of leadership worth following is that leaders should be worth following, right? And we think of that in terms of three broad buckets. One is you've got to have the capacity to lead. So can you help people and teams and organizations get where they need to go? You've got to have the commitment to lead. So are you willing to do the hard work and do the right things in order to make it happen? And then do you have the character to lead? So will you be the kind of person that people actually want to follow and that they should be following, right? And so developing yourself in all three of those areas is critical. But I do think that last one, character to lead, is the one that most people, it's getting more play these days, but I think that most people aren't as aware of that, or they're not as intentional in developing things like humility, gratitude, openness, transparency, all of those things. Those are critical for being a high character leader, and it's something that I think that people aren't necessarily as intentional in developing themselves on. I think people assume you either have it or you don't, but I think you can develop that.
Right, and then how does it actually tangibly work? How does what is the actual interaction between the leaders and leadership with following, or whatever organization they choose to work with?
Yeah, so our process, we have a ton of different processes, but basically, if you're a broader organization, you come to us kind of looking to either hire or promote or develop leaders, and so we do like role plays and simulations to kind of assess people. We do personality testing. We do lots of like in-depth interviews. So it's a very high-touch process and environment. And then the kind of the other piece of the puzzle is more just like coaching, and so we use assessments. One of the assessments is the drive, which is what I've kind of alluded to, and a lot of I mean that's just a 20-minute assessment, so people pop online, take it, and then we do some really high touch, in depth, impactful coaching to help people develop the self-awareness. And it's not just about self-awareness, but it is about the behavioral application as well. So specifically, what are you going to do differently? And then a lot of times we'll have like 360 assessments or things like that to give people a sense of, are you making the progress that you're intending to make?
I think one of the things that I'm really getting out of here, beyond a few things tangibly that I want to be more thoughtful for myself, but it's more of the idea that leadership is complex and it's not a single sport. And especially today, it's something that I think that there's also a bigger trend for the younger generation to grow into leadership roles much quicker, which with perhaps less stability, into inner stability, and with less skills to go and really have those debriefing moments and introspection, and what we started circling back, this thoughtfulness behind the intentionality behind the actions, and why we do what we do, and why we choose to act the way we choose to act. And so I'm gonna step after this conversation and think for myself a little bit. So thank you for that. But I think this was just wonderful, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be here. I have a few questions for Chris, not about leadership, not about what you're doing. Are you ready for them?
Yeah, let's go for it.
So going back to middle school and high school, what was one of your favorite classes?
So this is a cop out just because I'm a psychologist, but psychology was one. And then if I pick maybe a more surprising one, I actually really liked my AP calculus class.
Amazing. Very, very cool. Well, who would be a role model or somebody that inspires you in some way, shape, or form?
So this one, so I'm a Christian, so I have to go with Jesus. I mean, yes, that's a religious figure, but I do think that if you just look at the better parts of the movement that he inspired, Jesus is an inspiration to me, so I've got to go with him.
Wonderful. And the last question, 3 words that you would use to describe yourself.
So I would say creative. And for better or for worse, I'm actually a pretty serious guy at work, at least. Try not to be like that in real life, but that's how I end up at work. So creative, serious, I guess, or focused. And then let's see. I would like optimistic. I think I like to be pretty optimistic and forgiving about people. I try to, if someone does something wrong, I try to give them the benefit of the doubt. So I would say those 3.
Very, very, very cool. Chris, thank you so much for being here. This was wonderful. Stay safe and stay healthy and continue helping leaders become better leaders. At the end, making a more positive impact on the world. And thank you for sharing with me, your insights and your journey. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Michael.
Thank you.
Bye.